of star cults of Celtic Britain and its relationship to the placement of ancient and sacred sites in the landscape. Very important is that we ourselves have been working very closely with the sort of Celtic Welsh landscape over the last year. I said it's fully illustrated, it's not, but Jackie will make up for that in her own lyrical way. So without further ado, introduce Jackie Huxbury.
It's probably the first time I've ever seen anyone use one of these as a crib sheet. Some people go for computer simulations, but they're desperately difficult. It is a map of the night sky. You can rotate it so that you can see what the night sky is at any time of year. And I'll be showing you how we use it in our field in both Celtic studies. But I think you'll find that the principles will spill over so that it will make a lot more sense of, say, if you're into the Orion Mysteries type of thing, and then the sort of thing that Andy was talking about. My husband and I have been on this quest, as it were, probably since we met, which is about 6 years ago now. Although originally, for me, it starts a lot earlier, because I was actually brought up in the extreme west of Wales, in Pembrokeshire, which is part of a very magical and sacred landscape. And it's a place that my grandmother had come from, and all these different stories have been passed down in the valley about the place of stones brought from Stonehenge, and this is the real site where Arthur was buried, or this is the real site where Excalibur was. Little locations that probably really are only known to locals, and hardly ever seem to get a write-up in books, even though there's a massive amount written about Arthur and the Royal Legend and things like that. I found about 12 years ago I was having a series of dreams, and these dreams went on over a 2-year period, and it was very, very strange. I've never had anything like it before or since, where they were episodes from a life. Now I can't really even say today whether it's a reincarnation thing or whether I was having like a window on someone else's life, almost like a parallel existence. It was in a very rural landscape. It was obviously in this country. It was obviously a long time ago. Other than that, I couldn't say that there was anything very much to date it. In the dreams, I was seeing this life through the eyes of a young boy, and I was going around with an older man who was a bit of an eccentric, who would travel from place to place, would be living on our wits, keeping one step ahead of whatever the local law was. And as I said, this series of dreams went on over 2 years. I gradually began to find that places that I saw in the dreams, I would then find in real life, even though I wasn't particularly looking for them. And some of them were the most extraordinary places I couldn't possibly have known about before. For example, one of them was on a holy island that doesn't allow any cars, and it was the extreme opposite side of the island from the ferry. So, you know, it took you a couple of hours walking to get there. And there was this place exactly as it had been in my dream. I also found that other places in the dream, I wasn't really sure when I went there whether it was or not. And then I suddenly realised in the dream I'd been seeing it from a slightly different perspective. I'd been somewhat higher up. And I thought, well, this is a bit strange, what's all this about? And because I realised later, in the dream I'd been travelling in a horse and cart, and when I went there in a car, I was lower down, and my pin looked slightly different. But gradually these bits and pieces sort of came together, and I found someone who knew quite a lot about ancient Britain, and ran these ideas past him, and he asked me a lot of probing questions about what I could remember seeing, what were the people doing, what were the towns like, what type of people were there. And he came to the conclusion, he said, I think we can date them to about between 600 and 700 AD. He said it's that chaos period immediately after Arthur. And I said, oh. I said, well, that's a bit strange. I said, because I've got a distinct impression that the old man in the dreams is a druid. And he went, ho, 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 no, totally confused. No. I said, well, I thought they must have been earlier. Yes. The Romans wiped all the druids out, and obviously your dreams from 600 to 700 years later couldn't possibly have been any. So I thought, well, I that's right. And anyhow, I spent several years going around picking up bits and pieces of evidence of manuscript, and I thought to myself, he's wrong there. There might not have been visible white robe druids all around, but it was definitely there. There was definitely the odd chap out in the field as late as 600 or 700 AD, and I think that's what I'm seeing. However, although it was a curiosity, it wasn't something that took over my life until I sort of met my husband, and he was kind of the missing piece in the jigsaw puzzle because he's an astrologer, and I had just seen the Ross Nichols book of Druidry, and I said to him, have you seen that constellation listed there? And he said, oh, I didn't know the Celts were into constellations. He said, I thought that all came along with the Greeks. And I said, oh no, he thinks he's got a Celtic constellation list, there it is, the 37 remarkable sites. The trouble is, we can only pin down about 6 or 7 of them as to what they actually are. So we thought, wouldn't this be quite good? We did some research and we managed to figure out what all 37 are. Well, we're 6 or 7 years later and we're still, we've done less than a dozen of them. But what we did come up with within the research was a lot of visual imagery that relating to constellations that is actually hidden within sacred myth. Now, I use sacred myth advisedly. Some of the stories that I look to are actually in the Mabinogion and the Arthurian there. And you have to remember, I come from Wales. I've been in the school playground with a piece called Rhiannon in Merlin. It's not that far distant to us, although it sounds quite exotic up here. To me, Rhiannon was this sort of desperately spotty, overweight girl who was trying to laugh and played hockey rather well. It has a slightly different concept if you come from Wales, because they don't see it as being something like a long time ago. It's something that's ever present, and they're located in real places. But anyhow, that was my approach. That these Mabinogion stories I've been being told these alongside of Goldilocks and the Three Bears and all the other nursery rhymes since I can remember. So I think it was quite natural for me to go back to those and to see some sort of mythic element in there that also had a very pragmatic purpose. I was doing an Open University course as well a couple of years ago, where they were looking at Homer as part of the bardic tradition. In other words, not Homer as it's written down and translated, but just imagining yourself back at a time when the entertainment was all verbal and ever-present and acted out, and these stories were part spoken, part sung, part mimed, and they were really trying to put the life back into things like the Odyssey and the Iliad by getting you to imagine it as a performance art. And I thought, well, for goodness sake, if Homer was performed that way, then surely the Mabinogion tales were performed that way. And I started to see analogies between the structures of the two. One of the things that a bard does when he's telling stories is he has certain set pieces. So, for example, if I'm describing a magnificent feast, I have a menu set in my head. I have sort of a litany of what all the gold plates look like, how much wine there was, how long they fattened the kine. Now, I will go as a bard into that set piece, whether we're talking about the greatest feast at Arthur's court, or whether we're talking about the feast that they gave Odysseus the night he came home. It is my set piece. And this is one of the tricks by which the bards memorised their huge litany of tales. They had set pieces in between. Part of these set pieces are what they call formulaic epithets. So every time you come to a certain character, you go into a description because you're painting a picture of words. So, for example, Athena is always she who wears the aegis, or Athena with the flashing eyes. Yeah? And I just thought, well, hang on a minute, that's in the Mabinogion too. You have these epithets. And I did wonder exactly why the epithets got to be the way they were. And something a friend had said to me was very, very curious. He said, you know that bit in the Mabinogion tales where they find out that the Daiwa is being unfaithful to her husband, and the wrath of everything descends upon her. He said, have you ever wondered in that story why the serving women come in? And I said, well, no, it's just, he said, because I've checked all the different translations. He said, and every single translation it says, they caught up with Pedarian, and our Lord was so angry that when the serving women found out that he was coming, they walked backwards into a lake. He said, isn't that an odd thing to put in a story? And I said, yeah. He said, it's in every single translation, he said, from Charlotte West onward. He said, it's definitely in the story. And everybody translates it, but nobody knows what it was. Now, there was a marvellous book out at the time called The Death of Gods in Ancient Egypt by a woman called Sellers. And she remarked in there that the Egyptians also had these formulaic names for constellations. It's very common in cultures. For example, in the Manx culture, if a man is on board a ship, he can never refer to the star he's sighting by its proper name, or the moon by its proper name. He always has to give it an epithet. And all of the Egyptian god names that we know, things like Isis, it's not a real proper name. It was actually an epithet. And in Egyptian, it would have come out something more like Shield, it is the suitable power. Yeah? All of them are epithets. It was Greeks later on who tried to turn them into proper names. It's not thought to be polite or fortuitous to refer to something which potentially has great power by a direct name, such as you would attribute to an ordinary mortal. You have to refer to it by this epithet. And the epithet for Orion, the constellation, we have the name Sahi, but the epithet is the man who walks backwards. And I thought, now hang on a minute, the man who walks backwards, and we have these serving women who walk backwards. There has to be some sort of tie-up there. So I said to my husband, what I really need, I said, is something that shows me which ways the constellation move different times of year. I said, I've tried different computer simulations. I said, but they're very frozen. They tend to make what you put in a specific date. I said, but I really want to see sort of the passage of things. And he said, oh, what you want is one of these. They're plastic. So I played around with this, and they're very good actually, planispheres. You can get them from lots of different shops that sell maps. They're very, very cheap. They're very robust, so you can take them out with you when you do your field work. I mean, obviously, if you're at night, you're going to need a torch as well, but they're very forgiving. I wouldn't actually sort of take laptop PCs into some of the places that I have this. But anyway, and it was marvellous, because I could identify, for example, that the diary in the story, she's a constellation that you're going to see around about Beltane, maybe. So she's also something that is associated with bad luck. So you know from folklore exactly what you're looking for. You're probably looking for the Hyades. And her epithet is flower face. And indeed, if you look at the Hyades, you can imagine it is a little flower face. Behind the Hyades, the ones that seem to walk backwards into water are the Pleiades, the seven sisters. And in fact, if you set the planisphere up for Mayday, and you can actually get them going backwards, I would assume the water, a lot of these, if they're looking for a low horizon, they're out at sea or they're at coastal locations. Most of the Celts either lived on the rivers or by the coast. They didn't like living very far away from water. Water was kind of how they made their living, how they got around. So I had them, the Hyades and the Pleiades, as Pleiadian and the waiting women. And we carried these analogies on, and you could get time clues for some of the stories, what you were looking for. For example, we knew that in the fourth branch of the Mabinogi, the character Lou, it should be actually pronounced something like Clay in Welsh, but the anglicised version is Lou, the same deity as Lud, after whom Londinium is known. Tremendously popular all over the island, known by slightly different names in different regions. And we knew that he had to be linked to Lover's Land. So it's real simple to get the planisphere and to set it up for a date and time around about the beginning of August, when you would expect to see the first stars at nightfall, and you will see that the big dominant constellation that you get smack bang in the middle of the sky is Hercules. So obviously Hercules was the constellation that they identified as Lou. Now there's two predominant human-looking constellations in the night sky. One of them actually either side of the Milky Way. And in the story, Lou is portrayed by his wife, Godiwyd, and she takes her lover, Gronwy. And Gronwy, really, he plots with Godiwyd to murder him. And they come up with a very strange formula, a strange magical formula of how Lou can be killed. He's neither indoors nor outdoors. He has to have one foot on the back of a goat and the other one on the back of a water carrier to make him vulnerable so that they can kill him. Well, I looked at my planisphere. If Lou was in his zenith at Midnight, August Eve, then we would expect him to be at his weakest point at the opposite side of the year, which is in Wonk. It's around about sort of the beginning of February. Drew up the planisphere, and sure enough, what we have there, you can no longer see Hercules in the sky by that time. So in fact, he is vulnerable, he can die. This thing about on the back of the goat and the back of the water carrier, that time location is exactly halfway between Aquarius and Capricorn. So he's got one foot in Aquarius and the other one on the water trough, the water carrier. So we've got the Capricorn and Aquarius thing. In the legend, he's killed and he's turned into an eagle, and indeed that is the constellation you can see at that time of year. It's Aquila, the eagle. So you can see all these codings tied up in stories. You have this constant thing in stories of battle between two giants. You even have it linked into the landscape. For example, I suppose a lot of people heard of the Giant's Causeway in Ireland, and the story you have is there are two giants who were throwing stones at each other, having a battle. And we have this echoed in Gog and Magog, and oftentimes you have the Gog and Magog hills, where one belongs to one and the other belongs to the giant. So there's this constant theme of these two human-type constellations battling something out and never quite getting their own way. Because Hercules is the dominant constellation in the summer, and Orion is the dominant constellation in the winter. Now, there is a magical time of year, around about the shortest day, when you can actually see both within the same night. And I think this is perhaps where all the magical significance towards Christmas and that started to come. Orion dies, he disappears totally from the night sky, around about the time of Easter. And then there is a gap of about a fortnight, or sometimes longer, depending on the weather conditions, before you start to see Hercules. And Hercules starts to come up at Beltane, at May Eve. So Hercules is definitely identified, the rising Hercules with belly, after whom Beltane is named. And it seems to me that we had probably a festival of the dying king with Orion long before Christianity ever came along. But the Dying King Festival, around about Easter time, is actually associated with the fact that you can no longer see Orion here at that time. And that in fact Christian myth became tagged on much later, because if you check out the Bible, that isn't in fact the time of year that the Passion is supposed to take place at all. It takes place much later on. So anyhow, that was how we convinced ourselves that the different little bits and pieces fitted in. In terms of field work, what we found was that if a geographical location was given in the story, as opposed to a time location, that you could in fact tie things down to physical things in the landscape. And if I can give you an example, in the first batch of the Mabinogi, they're talking about Pembrokeshire as a magical landscape. Now, I didn't actually tweak this until we've been doing it for several years, and it was as a result of being at an FOI conference in this very hall. I came in while Baval and Hancock were doing their presentation, and they were actually showing on the screen just here some slides, some computer slides of the simulation of the night sky as it would have been several thousand years ago. What I found was it made me look at the Milky Way in a totally different manner. Just to recap, for those of you who aren't too familiar with the Orion mystery, the Nile is seen to the Egyptians as being a physical representation of the Milky Way. Now, the Milky Way has 1/3 end and one straight end, as does the Nile. The delta that gives out to the Mediterranean is forked, the rest of it is rather, well, it does have a kink in it, but it's straight, it doesn't give out to any tributaries. And this was, they see the night sky as Nut, the mother goddess, and her body is a notch of stars. I started to suspect that when the Celts were talking about their great night goddess, who is Dana in the Irish myth and Don in the Welsh Celtic form of myth, that in fact they were actually talking about the same thing. And when I saw these Babel simulations and he was showing the Milky Way at different angles, it suddenly reminded me of a totally different river. Not the Nile at all, but the Cleddau, which is the magical river that does run through Pembrokeshire. Now, it was from an area around the east branch of the Cleddau that the blue stones for Stonehenge were thought to have been brought down. And I've always felt, you see, Cleddau is one of these words in Welsh that's got several different layers of translation. One of the translations you can have for it is the word sword. And I've always felt that in the Arthurian myth, although Mallory tells us that Arthur was actually drawing a sword from the stone, what they're actually looking for, when they were trying to find the latest incarnation of Arthur, the one who would be their saviour for this generation, one of the acid tests for finding it is whether this child knew the answer to the riddle of the sword and the stone. And that was that these stones, the blue stones from Stonehenge, had been brought down the river Sword, and how they'd been gotten there. I think that was actually the conundrum that they were looking for, was a child who could demonstrate this bridge with the past and this bridge with tradition and the sense of where the whole nation was going and what needed to be done. Looking at the Cleddau as the Milky Way, what I found was that, in fact, the Celts had this way of encoding things, not only as a manner of reverence to their deities, but also for a really practical purpose. They carried around maps in their head. And we still do this. I mean, Andy gave me an illustration of this earlier when he was visualising the tube map, which everyone can do. Well, it probably will come to as no surprise to you that ancient Britons didn't go around with a tube map in their heads. What they went round with was a map of the constellations in their head. And they tended to make zodiacs, if you were, although when I say zodiac, it was all of the stars in the night sky, not just the zodiac family. They tend to make these terrestrial zodiacs, and I think in folk memory, we have the remnants of these at places like Glastonbury, but in fact Glastonbury wouldn't have been unique, they would have had them everywhere. In the first branch of the Mabinogion, the stellar references that you're given are that on May Eve, Pog was to sit on the mound of Narva, and he would either see a wonderful vision or he'd be beaten black and blue. Presumably that's the punishment if he didn't see the wonderful vision. The vision he actually saw was a lady on a white horse, it was Rhiannon. Now, if you take a planisphere and you set it up for May Eve, so that the Milky Way is lying in the same plane as the Cleddau River, in other words, the forked end of the Milky Way, which is up towards Sagittarius, yeah? If you look for where Nelbeth would be, what you actually get is Pegasus. That's the horse you saw. And on the back of Pegasus is Andromeda. She does really seem to be the lady that sat on the back of the white horse. Now, in the story it says that she progressed at a stately pace, and he sent out men to chase her, but no matter how fast they galloped, they couldn't catch her up. But if you look just behind Pegasus, there's another little constellation, Equus, which is like the little horse galloping behind, trying to catch her up, which of course he never does. So you do have a very graphic representation of what they were doing. In another of the stories, Culloch and Albin, you're told that one of Arthur's great feats was that he killed a huge boar called 12 Teeth that was ravaging the area. And he did this at a place called Aberdewi Brevi. Now, Aberdewi Brevi is the modern Milford Haven. And again, if you set your planisphere up so that Cleddau is the river, yeah, and they look for Milky Tape, and what they're going to find is the constellation Ursa Major, which they obviously identify as a huge ravaging ball. Now, for the bard, there's sort of two levels of verisimilitude within his story, because also around that area, you do find massive great mammoth tusks left over. So any time that the bard wanted to convince you that he was actually telling you the true story of ancient times, this was the tusk from the great boar that Arthur slew. Look at the size of it, you can imagine. And of course the deed was commemorated and put in the heavens. But the pragmatic purpose behind this is if you're out at sea in a boat and you spot the Milky Way, you have this little story map going on in your head to tell you one constellation, some of the other constellations there. That means I sail this way instead of that way. If I can give you an analogy, and I'm sure most of you are probably familiar with the Thames and the sort of London landscape, I'd like to give you a quick thumbnail sketch of how this would work in local surroundings, because it's a really usable technique today. So if I said to you, right, the Milky Way is the Thames, right? We have a forked end, that's the wide bit that goes out to sea, and you don't have to be scientific or do any number crunching with this. We have a narrow end, yeah, that's its source. Where we're at now, this is the typical you are here map. In the Conway Hall, we would be on the back of the Great Bear Ursa Major. But he's upside down, his head is pointing down towards the river. Okay. If we're looking out towards Essex, Hercules is stood in Essex. Can you see that in your mind's eye? Because this is Locke method of remembering. And I promise you, you will never forget where the constellations are, one method to know. Imagine Hercules with his great big cluster in Essex. Right, down in Kent, in Gravesend, you've got a great big eagle, Aquila. We come up a bit, the Blackwall Tunnel, you have to imagine there's a great big swan lying across the river, and its neck, the neck as thick as the swan, is actually the Blackwall Tunnel. You will never forget this, I promise you. Absolutely perfect. And imagine, I mean, you can take this with you. This is a map you can never lose, you can never get it wet, it can never fall overboard. Well, the person can fall overboard in the ship, but you've got other problems then at that stage. Okay, if we're looking at Andromeda, she's a lady who's lying on her back. She's a tremendously big constellation. One foot probably would be in Southwark, and the other one would be right the way down in Clapham. Yeah, that's her feet, and her head would probably extend, well, she'll say up about as far as Battersea. So all of that area is enclosed in a big constellation called Andromeda. And going now from us into the West End, probably we're going through the constellation of the Lynx, yeah, and if you're going out towards Knightsbridge, then the twins, Gemini, are there. So do you get the idea? It's using more constellations than the zodiac. You can use it with any landmarks. I mean, I've used modern ones. They probably would have used hills, groves of trees, outcrops of rock, anything that occurred in the natural landscape. And you do sometimes find the name of it still attached. For example, in Pembrokeshire, there is a place called Wolf's Castle. And I think the wolf is another name for Ursa Major. I have always thought the head on Ursa Major looks more like a wolf than a bear. It's just got that more sort of elongated look to its snout. Now, one of the things that I did find really fascinating, and I thought to myself, well, if they're talking about the Clerbine River as being the Milky Way, and the stones, the blue stones, were brought from the eastern branch, then surely, if I look along the eastern branch of the Milky Way, I ought to find some really, really important constellation there that will give me a clue as to what their beliefs were and what they were about. And I looked at all this planetary, I sort of didn't come up with anything. And I thought, oh, that's disappointing. Maybe the whole thing just doesn't come together. And then I did what you're not supposed to do, which is sort of look at the edge and have a look. Because, of course, this one is set around the pole star as it is now, Polaris. Now, I don't want to go too scientific, but the precession of the great ages are caused because the moon is actually very, very close to Earth. much closer than most satellites with planets are. It's also very big. In fact, some people have said it's actually a bit more like a twin planet than it is a satellite. It seems to break the rules of all the other things that we know of, that we call moons. And it's so big and it's so close. What it actually does is it creates a slight wobble on the Earth's atmosphere, on the Earth's rotation. It's a wobble that's so slight, it's got a 26,000-year cycle. And if you're on the Earth, the effect that you can perceive in this wobble is that the pole star actually appears to change. So if we went back to the time when they were building Stonehenge, when they were building the monuments out in Egypt, we wouldn't in fact have seen Polaris as our pole star. We would have been looking at a much brighter star called Vega. Now Vega is the one that sits next to Hercules. If you can imagine Hercules as a chap with a great big club in his hand, then Vega would be that club. And it is a star that appears to be enormously important within myth. I think the Egyptians had it. They had Hercules as a manifestation of Horus. And when you see these poses of the pharaoh with the great mace lifted above his head, and this is the divine weapon in which he's going to smite his enemies, that mace is meant to be Vega. So if I adjusted this and put Vega at the centre, I found that I could actually see things much more out towards the edge. And this circular constellation that I've been looking for at the eastern branch of the Milky Way is actually there. It's the one that we now call Corona Australis, because normally it can now only be seen from the southern hemisphere. But if we had Vega as our pole star instead of Polaris, believe me, it would have been there, and it would have been quite near to the horizon. Now, the interesting thing about Corona Australis is it's not a perfect circle, it's an ellipse, it's a flattened circle. And we do know that all the earlier circles are not circular, they are elliptical, they are deliberately flattened. And this isn't just because, they didn't have good measuring tools those days, because it's dead easy to do a circle. They did circles for all their roundhouses. All you do is you get a length of rope or leather or anything like that, you stick a pole in one end and you get someone to walk around the outside, perfect circle, and then you just mark where you want the poles or your stones to go in right there. So we have to assume that if they've done a flattened circle or an ellipse, which actually is a really difficult shape to draw, it's not as easy to draw as a circle. If they did that, then that is exactly what they meant. And I defy anyone to find another constellation that looks elliptical. In doing this and experimenting with this, I think they saw at Woodhenge that this ellipse shape is very, very important. It explains why the planets move the way they do, why the planets on the smaller elliptical orbits sometimes appear to stand still and sometimes appear to go backwards. And Woodhenge is a series of these elliptical things paced out. And I can just imagine them sort of having a guy stood in the centre pretending to be the sun and having people going round at varying different speeds to try and work out exactly what planets did. I think they also enshrined in their folklore different principles about what the constellations did, different as by acting it out. For example, the May Day celebrations, where you stick a pole in the middle, that pole is to represent the pole star. You then bring in characters in the May Day procession, like the hobby horse. This is Pegasus. Yeah? You have a May Queen. This is Andromeda on the back of Pegasus. You have a dancing bear. That's another traditional one. That's the Great Bear, also can be seen at that time of year. You have the Jack and the Green. That's their version of Hercules. So we have these things enshrined in folklore about how they used to act these things out in dances. And I think they started teaching these things way from when kids were really, really small. You might not have got the gist of what actually was going on until you were older, but you certainly could remember the characters, you could remember the dances, you could remember who did what to where and where it happened in the stories. They had to get you young. People didn't live that long in those days. So having decided that Corona Australis was probably the original site where the blue stones were, this gave you a really good reason about why they might have moved them. Because at a certain time when the pole star shifted, they could no longer see that constellation. So they moved their terrestrial monument from the edge of what was their land then, because that would have been the edge of the ice floe at the time, and they moved it to a more central location. I believe the circular model for the later circles is actually the constellation Corona Borealis. Now, Corona Borealis is more circular, but it also is horseshoe-shaped. And I'm sure any of you who've gone to Stonehenge will know that there is a very significant horseshoe pattern in the middle of it. So they're echoing the shape of this constellation, and they're also echoing where they're located, because it's something that's more central in the night sky. They move it to a more central location within their landmass. And Stonehenge would have been very central for them then, because the ice floe would have come down much further than it does now. So they would have been measuring top to bottom of the country a different distance than we do now. Another monument that you can see it in where it's very, very marked is the Cyrenaica Giant. The Cyrenaica Giant is a depiction of Hercules, yeah? And probably there was a lot more to that monument than what we now see. As I said, you've got Vega, which is the club in one hand. Down in the other hand, there's a chap called Rodney Allerton who's done some geophys on it, and there is actually, as in the Kennedy conspiracy, the secret is within the grassy knoll. There is a grassy knoll by the left hand of Hercules, and he's convinced that that was actually part of the sculpture. So Hercules was actually holding something. And we think from sort of Celtic artwork that what he's holding is a severed head. And if you look at the constellation Hercules, you do in fact get Corona Borealis coming just under the left hand. So this is the severed head. So again, I think this is a reference back to the sort of Celtic head and the importance of that. Immediately above Hercules, immediately above the Cyrenaica Giant, for any of you who know the monument, there is a very strange trapezium-shaped enclosure known locally as the Trendle. Now, if you look at a map of the night sky, the Trendle would correspond to the head of Draco, or the dragon. Now, because of this 26,000-year procession thing, Draco, or the head of the dragon, was in fact a pole star at one time. So Vega was important, but even further back, Draco was important. And I think we have this enshrined in Arthurian myth by the fact that Arthur's father is Pendragon, head of the dragon. So I think you have to imagine that the original Cyrenaica Giant is part of something where he's actually fighting off with a club in one hand this serpentine dragon thing that would have gone on top of him on the hill, and lower down in his other hand he's simultaneously vanquishing his human enemies, and he's got a severed head in that hand, so he would have looked a bit more gory than he does now, but it's quite amazing that as much of it has been preserved, but it's definitely supposed to mimic what's happening in the night sky. I'd like to offer this up to you as a methodology, because I think a lot of people, when they do question work, you are receiving a flood of psychic images coming through. They can sometimes be linked to times, and they can sometimes be linked to geographical locations. And as I said, with my dreams, they didn't make sense until I got them in the right framework, in the right methodology. What I'd like to say to you is, if you get visual images coming through that could possibly be constellations, things like horses, bears, giants fighting, ladies on white horses, one thing and another, do have a look at where the local river lies. Try and size up your landscape to where the estuary for the river is, whether it's got a forked end and a straight end, and match that up to the Milky Way. As I said, the forked end of the Milky Way is towards Sagittarius. Okay, so you can't really go wrong. You don't need to have any complicated maths. You may find that if you're getting through images, as I say, of a white horse, you're talking about something like Pegasus, and you will actually be able to go straight to a geographical location. Because I think when we receive these images through on a psychic level, that we are actually communicating with an elder intelligence who, during their incarnate years, as I say, instead of carrying around the London Tube map in their head, they carried around their terrestrial locations in a metaphoric sense, in a sense of stories and remembered traditions and things that happened at places. And when we get these floods of images coming through directly, in fact, it is within that code framework. It works just as well for other cultures, as I said, the Egyptian myth, because the Milky Way is the Nile. In Greek stories, you do actually have some very recognisable characters in Greek myth as well. For example, in the Odyssey, I think you're talking about Orion being Odysseus, and the sun who comes looking for him, who does the other journey on the other side of the Mediterranean, is his son Telemachus. That's Hercules. And it's the Mediterranean, actually, there, that becomes the Milky Way. That is their central sea mass. And I know to us it may not look very much like a river, but it does have one end that gives out to the Atlantic Ocean, which is its forked end, and then it goes up into the Black Sea, etc., at the other end. So they just see it as one continuous piece of water. It also goes across to Vedic myth very, very easily. In the end of the Odyssey, we have Odysseus winning his bride Penelope with the great bow. And in fact, you do have Orion, who looks like he's got one arm outstretched as an archer. Penelope sits weaving a tapestry every night. And this tapestry, in fact, in the metaphor is the Milky Way. There's a constellation at the top, Cassiopeia, that appears to be a seated woman. Now, if you look at little pictures of Greek women weaving, they wove on their laps. They had a little sort of lap loom. They didn't weave upright like we do. They wove on a little thing there. And they just had a little lap guard that went over their lap, and they did weaving on a very, very small loom. So this tapestry is coming from Penelope every night, isn't it? And it tells you in the story, she kept her suitors at bay by weaving the tapestry, and then it was unravelled every night. So this is their metaphorical way of seeing Penelope there, as she's weaving the tapestry until Odysseus comes home. So some of them are really nice. In Vedic myth, in Ramayana, again, you have the hero winning his bride by a contest with a huge bow, which again goes to Orion. And to a modern framework, we seem to want to say, well, yes, but Orion is this. And of course, he's not one thing. Orion has as many different guises as there are storytellers. Each storyteller has his own version. There are as many different versions of the story as there were cold winter nights to keep people entertained. There is no one right version. There's a wealth of different traditions that sort of intertwine and mingle like Celtic knotwork. And sometimes what we're experiencing when we go out questing is that we take little gems, little mosaic pieces from that pattern, and we get these flashes of inspiration that are coming through from the crude draft of human experience. So if you fancy going out and doing some celestial questing on a terrestrial plane, I do offer that up to you as an invitation, and I'd like to thank you for being such an attentive audience. Thank you.
Right, now, Egypt. You may say, well, this is a little bit different to your normal psychic questing activity. Well, it is and it isn't. I mean, things have developed over the past few years, as is obvious from the books which I'm now doing. We are going into new fields. The old Black Alchemist or Seven Swords style questing of, clearing off around the landscape, digging holes in the ground just for the sake of it. I won't say it's over. It's moving on. it seems as if the main goal for psychic questing now is the quest for knowledge, which is probably what it always has been over the past 20 years. But what's happening now is the fact that I'm using it to obtain answers, or certainly new clues, new leads, which will hopefully reveal more and more about the sort of mysterious origins of human civilization, whether it be Egypt, whether it be, you know, in the Americas or wherever. And we both do this. We do this in, you know, sort of meditation states and out in the landscape, hoping that we'll sort of trigger something off and another piece of the jigsaw will be given to us. Now, you won't find this material in books, I'm afraid. The simple reason that my own writing style is changing, and although I had some psychic stuff in the book which will be coming out in February, I had to really take out because it just didn't fit in there. There is references to the likes of Bernard and whatever, and I'll come on to the reasons why in a minute, but you know, it's almost as if it's a separate entity, as if, you know, there is this guy who's picked up some bits and pieces. That's the way I find it has to be, because if you try to get something across in a scholarly manner, you cannot back it up with psychic information. You can mention that certain events related to psychic things are going on, particularly this figure Casey, which I'll mention later on, who is the American psychic who's been coming up with, or has come up with a load of prophecies relating to Giza Plateau, which is now virtually influencing everything that goes on at Giza. And you cannot avoid things like that. So that's as if it kept fish. But we shall go back to last year, or the beginnings of all this, because I was told, no, not last year, it was earlier on this year, in May, that I could go on a tour of Egypt, give a couple of lectures with David Roll and Ancient World Tours through Theomy Travel. Just give a couple of lectures on sort of from the Ashes of Angels stuff, and you'll be able to visit various of these nice sites along the Nile. So I thought, yeah, okay, fine. I'll sort that out. Now, within a week of this, me having said yes, weird things started occurring. 3 psychics that I know, Debbie Benson, who will be here later on, had a weird dream about me in Egypt and being swept along the Nile, and she didn't have any knowledge at all that I'd been, you know, made this up. My colleague Bernard, who you know sort of black out from the 7 Swords stories, he also had this dream of me standing in front of the Great Sphinx with my arms out, watching the sunrise or something. Which again, he had no knowledge of the fact I was going out there, and he hadn't had any weird psychic dreams for many, many months. And the weirdest of them was from a friend of mine called Paul Kiffin, who is Richard Ward's cousin. Now, Paul knows very little at all about ancient Egypt, but he had a dream where he was at this temple structure made of huge stone blocks with like a stone island in the middle of it and water around it, and there were like these sort of chambers or niches each side of it, and there was another separate chamber, and he could hear his cousin's voice saying, you know, you've got to tell Andy about this is really important, this is really important. And standing in the centre of the island was a dog-headed individual, quite clearly an Egyptian god. And Richard, when he first heard this, obviously within a day of it occurring, you know, assumed, as I assumed myself, that this figure was Anubis, the jackal-headed god, very prominent, very important deity in Egyptian religion. Now, when I heard about this, I'd also just been told by David Roll that we wouldn't be able to go to one particular site, and that was the very site which I was conscious of the fact that this was what Paul had dreamt of, a place called the Assyrian at Abydos. Now, Abydos is in southern Egypt. It's one of the oldest cemeteries for royal burials in the country. It goes back to pre-dynastic times, which is sort of pre-3000 BC, and was used by the first couple of dynasties of kings as a royal burial ground. And there's a temple there of a much later date, built by a guy called Seti I, who reigned about 1300 BC. And next to it, or joined to it, and on exactly the same axis and orientation, is this really weird structure called the Osirian, which you can see here. Well, part of it at least anyway. This is how it looks now. It's flooded. There's an actual well in it, which fills it with water, and the central island eventually disappears, and every 5 years or so, they'll take the water down, clean the whole thing up, and the water will gradually fill up once more. Now, it's made of huge cyclopean blocks, massive blocks, some of them estimated possibly as much as 200 tonnes. But in general, we're talking 50 to 100 tonne blocks. And it's in a style very reminiscent of the Valley Temple at Giza. Now, the Valley Temple is also huge blocks with lintels on the top, and has been associated with the Sphinx and the redating, which suggests that all of these temples had their original foundation not during dynastic Egypt, but much earlier, possibly as early as 9,000 BC, with what we refer to as the Elder Culture, or the Elder Culture of Egypt. Now, this is irrelevant for the moment, because I'll come back to this. Now, various other people around here have been having sort of weird dreams and things about Anubis, and I felt that this was, sort of leading towards something. Now, we've been told that we couldn't go to the Osirian because it was in a part of Egypt, which includes most of what now generally referred to as Middle Egypt, and because of the terrorism, the Islamic fundamentalists causing problems, that the stretch between virtually Abydos and much higher up in the area of the Fayum was not accessible to any visitors, and the Osirian itself had been closed and you just couldn't get to it. I mean, for instance, Graham Hancock, who featured in his book, has been trying to get back there for the past 3 or 4 years and can't get there. So I thought, wow, I really wanted to go to this place. Look, I'll tell you what, let's do a meditation. I heard about Paul's dream that night, and let's do a meditation visualising Anubis, like calling out, sort of Jekyll's call, and sending out like this ripple around from Abydos outwards across the whole of, middle to southern Egypt. So that all these sort of terrorists sort of drop down their guns and just go away and leave the place, and it's open. So, it was sort of stuff we do on a Saturday night, So we do this, and I think, well, hopefully it might work. Hopefully we'll hear something within the next 6 months which will say that yes, the Osirian is now open and that we can go there. So, end of the story basically. We come up to the beginning of October, and that's Anubis, obviously, the jackal-headed god. And we're into the Valley of the Kings. So that's it. Now, basically, I've almost forgotten all about this. And the only sort of thing which, but before I went away, I said to people, if there's anything that you want me to bring you back specifically, I'll bring you back a little gift or something, but if there's anything specific you want me to look for, let me know. And my friend and colleague, Storm Constantine, the novel writer, science fantasy writer, she said, that they're really into bass. They do a few meditations relating to bass, the cat gods. If you see a standing bass statue out there, get it for us. We've been looking for one all over the place, and if you find one, bring it back. I'll pay you if it's costs a lot of dosh or whatever. Yeah, no problem. So I just had that in the back of my mind when I went out there, having sort of just left the book and just sort of got on a plane and shot out there, basically, about 3 or 4 days behind everybody else. When I get to Luxor, Looked around a couple of shops the first night that we got there, but I didn't really sort of take anything in. And the next day went to the Valley of the Kings. Now, this here is 255. I'm certainly not going to talk all about that, but my colleague Graham Phillips will do, not today, but almost certainly next year, because he's got a book which is coming out in February, bizarrely enough, almost the same day as mine, called Act of God, which heavily focuses on the Amarna Age and the whole mystery surrounding this tomb, who was found here in 1907. Some people say that it was Akhenaten, some people say that it was his co-regent and separate pharaoh, Smenkhare. And that's one of the enigmas that Graham covers in this book. I mean, I know it's in it, and it's going to be a splendid book. Oh my God. I walked all over the place. So, now, I mean, some of these tombs are covered in the most beautiful imagery relating to the passage, the journey of the sun god into the underworld, which is known as the Anduat, or just the Duat. And I'm not going into this, but essentially this encodes within it important information about this underworld structure or complex, which a lot of people talk in terms of the Hall of Records being beneath the Great Sphinx, the Giza Plateau as a whole. And some of the material within it describes it in great detail, describes what it contains, everything about it. And this is one of the areas that I go into in Gods of Eden in high detail, basically. Now, this is just some of the stuff which I was just photographing as I was going along. Now, the other thing which I learned for the first time, now, I mean, how many of you here, if you're interested in Egyptian mysteries, have heard of a goddess called Mertziger, or Mertziger? She is the goddess who guards over the necropolis of the dead at Thebes, i.e. the Valley of the Kings, Valley of the Queens, etc., etc. And she was sort of set up as this role, and she's half serpent and half vulture, although she can also take the form of the scorpion. And essentially, you know, if you disturb the tombs, it was to her, this fierce aspected goddess, that you would have to answer to. And now, I didn't know this. I mean, I've never heard this thing. I mean, I've been writing about the vulture goddesses of Egypt in the new book, and, you know, I've not come across her name. I thought, oh, fine, you know, yo, Mertziger, so I feel I can give these goddesses and whatever a yo when we go there. Now, we also visited Karnak the next day, and this here is a fallen obelisk of the queen, or female king, Hatshepsut. Now, it's only 1/3 of its original size, and there's this little trick you can play that if you go up to it and start banging it, that it will start humming and resonating for about and then just let it go for about 30 seconds. It will just hum in this most incredible way. The acoustics of it are really incredible. And sadly, unfortunately, they've now concreted it down to the base. It doesn't do it anymore, but as we found to our amusement. But you know, this is sort of something that's going on. Now, this was really early in the morning, and from here we went to a place called the chapel or house of Ptah, sort of creator god of Memphis, and his consort was, and obviously still is. I'll have the next slide, please. This lady here, who is Sekhmet, as I'm sure most of you will recognise from the statues in the British Museum, and obviously a favourite amongst many people interested in Egyptian mysteries. Now, there's this tiny little chapel which is totally in darkness, and she is in there in this form, this beautiful, dark, I think it's probably basalt statue, which dates to the period of Akhenaten's father, Amenhotep III, and her head's probably been cut off. If you can just lower it down slightly, just to show it. Right, and this is only illuminated by a small hole. It's only illuminated by a small hole bowl above it, which shines down just enough light to give it this most incredible reflective quality. And we got there early in the morning, myself, Simon, and two of the lads from the cruise, and we were able to do a meditation in there without any of the guards, or anybody being around. And normally, you know, this place is locked and you cannot get in there at all. Or even when you can get in there, there's a couple of the guards around, you know, making sure you don't get up to mischief. And we were able to get in there, and just at the point that we finished this meditation, full meditation to do with Sekhmet, one of the guards came in, saw us, you know, sort of standing there in the dark, and having just finished our meditation, didn't know whether to laugh or cry, basically. But luckily, the rest of the tour then sort of appeared, and we were able to sort of wave to them, and they sort of waved to us, and we diffused the situation, and it was perfect timing. And from that point onwards, I mean, I was looking for something to sort of set things off, and I felt that this was magical. Well, this was a good event which sealed some kind of bond between ourselves and, you know, the ancient magic of Egypt, which would now continue. Right. Now, I'll just show this just because it's obviously a beautiful picture and a very beautiful statue. This is the Pharaoh Akhenaten, and this is one of two faces which have been taken from the colossi that were found at Luxor temple nearby. This was before he moved to his city on the edge of the eastern desert called Reincarnation, Tel El-Amarna in Middle Egypt. And I mean, I just love this picture because, I mean, it almost looks like he's smiling. He's got a wry smile on his face. You know, he's completely turning the whole of Egypt on his head, and he's just got this smile on his face. And you know, I think it's a beautiful image, and it's the front cover, obviously, for Cyril Waldron's important book on Akhenaten. Just another image of it. You see this smile here. Right, now, I mean, I'm building things up because I want to show you the sequence of events from my perspective, and then I'm going to tell you what was going on to other people in Britain at the same time. This is a place called Dendara. It's just further down the Nile, even though we're going north now. And it's a beautiful Ptolemaic temple, dates to sort of 1200 BC. It's obviously in the style of ancient Egypt. And it's an incredible place. It's probably one of the most haunted of all of the temples along the Nile. The guides will tell us all sorts of weird stories about, you know, sort of ancient Egyptian princesses appearing, and all sorts of weird experiences down a long corridor inside this place, which is full of the most incredible images. This is me looking, well, not me, but the image looking down from the top of the temple, the roof. So this place here, which is the Nilometer, somewhere, it's up there. Anyway, the Nilometer is water that's funneled all the way from the Nile, which is quite some distance from here, I'm not sure exactly how. And it's like a well, but it marks the height of the Nile inundation, etc., etc. And we saw a couple of ladies, you know, quite Islamic ladies, with their partners going down into this Nilometer, you know, looking at it in terms of a well, and coming out. So we asked one of these guys what they were up to, and it seems as if this place is renowned for its effects on women who, you know, want to get fertile, or want to pay this, right? And who can't. And they go down the Nilometer, wash themselves, right? Then they come inside the temple, go into the crypts. I'll try and show you this now. Could you pull it down a bit and show the top of this? This incredible snake on the wall down in the crypts. And the women will actually go before this snake and do a bit of a weird one there in front of it. And, you know, hopefully afterwards they'll get pregnant. I mean, that was almost the words that I used.
And I thought, this is incredible. You know, this is how many thousands of years after, you know, the ancient Egyptians left our world, and yeah, this was still going on. And I thought, that's a nice little magical act. I like that. And you know, I found out that there are other similar things. For instance, that statue of Sekhmet that I showed you has in fact been put together again because local villagers smashed it up a few years ago because they wanted to stop Sekhmet walking at night. And what's all that about then? So, you know, in other words, the power of ancient Egypt is still very strong over there. You know, even amongst this quite clearly local Islamic peoples. And obviously there's a lot of Copts as well, of the ancient Christian faith. Now, from there we went on to the Assyrian. I've already described this to you. I do apologise about these slides. As I said, at the top of it was being cut off. We'll see if we can sort something out from the later lectures. But you can just see the size. I understand what's going on here. The size of some of these blocks. I mean, this here, we're talking probably between 50 and 70 tonnes, I should think. This is in a style that's unique to Egypt. Just the Assyrian, the Valley Temple, a few of the other Valley or mortuary temples on the Giza Plateau, and one other place we'll get to investigate just north of Lafayette, the Lake Maurice. That is unique, you know, and this does not relate to any period of ancient Egypt other than the Pyramid Age, and we believe a much earlier period too, about 9,000 BC. So the Assyrian, for instance, can only really have been constructed, you know, during this phase, not as the Egyptologists would tell us, by the Pharaoh Seti I in 1300 BC. I mean, they just think that it was a part of the temple, but I'm sorry, it's just not. You know, and I don't want any open-minded person that studies this site will realise that. And a number of more unorthodox Egyptologists have actually come out and said that, you know, the Assyrian is clearly much older. Anyway, myself, Simon Cox, spent a lot of time studying this. Now, I will be mentioning this site in Gods of Eden, obviously, but it will probably come even more important for a book which I'll be doing afterwards, which I'll tell you about a bit later, but that will be more looking at the whole global perspective of the elder culture, its effects all over the world. Now, you just see this. Now, okay, I was the only person that managed to get right the way down to the water's edge, because we sort of didn't really go with the main tour. We sort of broke away, did our own thing, myself and Simon and one or two others. And I got right down the water. Now this is the sort of plank type thing that you can walk down, you know, with a rail. And as I sort of got to this point, it sort of started to sink. I was going, anyway, it managed to hit the bottom before I got too wet. And yeah, I was looking at this water, it's green, as you can quite obviously see here. I mean, it's supposed to have snakes in it and God knows what else. And I mean, you know, you just do not drink the water in Egypt, you know, unless you want to die and go to heaven and be rebirthed again. You know, you have to be very, very careful. King Tut's revenge hit probably about 95% of the people on the boat. You know, I was laughing at this point, I haven't got it, didn't know the rest of it. And about 3 or 4 days into the journey, whack! I was out for 24 hours completely. But anyway, I'm at this side, I thought, you know, God, this is murky water. So I got down, I put a bit on the forehead, you know, just sort of some sort of respect to the site. And anyway, I'll jump back to now. I was speaking to Judith Page, the artist over the back there, about the Assyrian, and well, I'd gone to her house about a year ago, and she'd given me some water from a holy well in Egypt. She said, oh, I drink this all the time, and have some, you know, so I drank it. And I thought, yeah, it's water. Then it's obviously sacred, great, thanks a lot, right? When I spoke to her on the telephone, she said, oh, don't you realise that water actually came from this Assyrian? It's what you were drinking. It's pure and clean. fair enough. If I'd have known it, I probably would have forgotten that pleasure. I'm not quite sure that I was well or not afterwards. I'm sure I was all right. Right, what was that? Right, so that's just me doing a bit of surveying, and Simon, who you will hear from tomorrow, taking a few photographs and videoing the whole thing. It's a very, very important. I can't stress the importance. Now, obviously, we didn't get a chance to do anything magical there. We were there for 45 minutes. We heard it in, heard it out, basically, because, sorry, what I forgot to mention is just a matter of weeks before we went, we were told that we could now go to Abydos, and clearance had been given, and we were one of the first Nile cruises to actually get to Abydos, and you know, this has seen virtually no tourists over the past 5 years, you know, and it's only just been opened, and the chances are that because of problems with the boats getting stuck on the mud banks and in the Nile, which is what happened to us, we got stuck on the mud bank for 24 hours, they may even have to rethink again about Middle Egypt. Plus there's been more terrorism. I mean, just a few days before the trip left, you know, 9 people, 9 Germans were shot, killed, blown up in a bus just outside the pyramids. But of course, you know, that meant that there was so much security everywhere, as you'll see from one or two of the pictures, that nothing was going to happen to any tourists whilst we were out there. But anyway, we got back to the boats after having been to came out of this area, came out of the temple, and there was a couple of little stalls before we got back on the coach. Now, most people avoided and went straight back on the coach. I thought, well, hold on, these poor guys have not seen any tourists over the past 5 years. You know, at least give them a bit of respect and see what they've got to sell. So I walked straight up, and there's this statue, this bass statue, about 5-6 inches, like faience, and it was beautiful. They had hieroglyphs all down the back, all the rest of it, and a few other bits and pieces. And we only had a few minutes. I was with Simon. He bought a scarab beetle, which the guy said was genuine. It turns out that it is. It's a genuine scarab beetle from the reign of Seti I, 1300 BC. But I mean, we didn't obviously realise this. But we bought this gear, walked away, and he said, I think, you know, there might be 1 or 2 pieces here that are actually genuine, because a lot of genuine stuff gets mixed up with, you know, the replicas that they sell to the tourists. So many middlemen and kids buying stuff and selling it on or whatever, that at the end of the day, they don't really know what they're selling. And often you can find genuine articles, you know, on some of these stalls. Well, I got back to the boat. I also got quite a few Anubis statues. I thought that's a good card, you know, because I remembered what Paul had seen at the Assyrian before. And I was looking at this bass statue, and I thought, this is special. There's something about this that's very important. And I was looking at it. The more I looked at it, and the more I saw it, the fact it was caked up, a little bit bashed about. It wasn't sold to me as genuine. Unfortunately, I haven't got a picture of it to show you. I thought this could be genuine, you know. And I showed it to Simon, showed it to one of the other people, and they said, yeah, you might be right. It wasn't sold to me as such, but it could have been, and may well be. And I'll come on to, you know, some of the events around it in a minute which suggest that it might be so. Got to the boat, did a meditation based on the Assyrian. Got everybody to go in mind for the Assyrian. We saw Anubis standing on the centre of the island. He opened like a door which led down through the island to like an underworld domain. Osiris was there, he resurrected, then we allowed our minds to wander. This was the first proper meditation we've done with the group, about 15 people. And the first thing I realised as I sort of went into this meditation is, for some reason, this is not Anubis. Nothing to do with Anubis at all. And I felt it was this Warat, the opener of the ways, who is basically the black dog, who is the guardian of the dead, but also opens the ways into the underworld. And that there's this that Paul had said, and that the connection with Anubis in the site is not quite right at all. So I thought, yeah, okay. And he's also seen as a wolf as well. You know, a human form wolf, or sometimes, in fact, I think I've probably got a slide to show. This is what we're at. This is not the jackal, this is the black dog, you know, the sort of wild dog, basically. Sometimes seen as a wolf. And I felt this was very, very important. I also felt that that something had to be done, a sketch with Wakwarat at this Coptic church which Debbie Benson picked up in 1994, dedicated to Abu Sergius, St Sergius, in Old Cairo, the old run-down claustrophobic streets of Old Cairo. Now she picked up this was the entrance into an underworld domain of a realm called Kher-Ahar, which was, I later found out, one of the areas associated with the old religious centre of Heliopolis in northeast Cairo. And I also found out only this year that she was right, that there was considered to be an underworld domain, and that the entrance to it was through the crypt of this church. And I just felt it was important to go to this church and do a meditation, entering the underworld with Wakwarat as the guide. You know, just something to do with the Giza Plateaus, something to do with the Hall of Records and the opening of them and all the rest of it. So this is important, this change of Wakwarat. Now, I'll almost certainly forget to tell you later, so I'll tell you now that we only found out within the past couple of weeks that the true god of Abydos is not Osiris. That only really came about in Middle Kingdom times, probably about 2000 BC. But before that, it was a god called Khenti-Amenti, who is a form of Wakwarat. And this was the original god of Abydos, and therefore was almost certainly the original god form connected with the Osirian. So to me, that's bloody good stuff, particularly Paul's dream, you know, that we should be led to all this in the first place. So bear this in mind for some of the stuff that's happened since. Now this is just an example of the security machine gun actually on the Nile cruise itself. There's armed things. Does that focus up anymore? They're not. Okay, not to worry. Right, and this is what's happening. Eventually we had to go in convoys of 4 to go up there because as you pass through Middle Egypt, you know, snipers could take a ship pot at you at any time, and being stuck for 24 hours on the mudbank wasn't that much fun, really, particularly as you knew you were sitting ducks, basically. I mean, we also visited Tel El Amarna. This was Akhenaten's city, constructed about year 4 to 6 of his reign. He ruled about 1350 BC, and as I said, you know, there's about 3 chapters in my new book on Akhenaten and his obsession with the concept of the first time, the age of the elder gods. This is brand new material and will show how he fits into the whole picture. Because I think that of all the Egyptian pharaohs, he became obsessed with this idea that there'd been an earlier age of the gods, at the time of the first time, trying to recreate it himself. And in doing so, nearly collapsed the whole of Egyptian history. So this is in the book. That's, by the way, sorry, that's the only image really left of Tel El Amarna today. Just go back to it. Yeah, there's a couple of huge columns visible here which have been re-erected only recently by a British Egyptologist. There's very little left of the city at all. When tourists go there, they just look at the tombs, basically, in the west, east, I don't know, not right, in the cliffs anyway, beyond it. No, the eastern cliffs. And they hardly ever are allowed to go here. So, you know, we were probably the only tour guide. The only reason we were able to get in there was basically because David Rowe knew the locals. And sort of went and had tea with them and sort of did the old peace offering stuff, and we were able to get there. Now, before we go on to Giza, just to let you know what happened. Eventually it just became so problematic on the Nile itself that we had to abandon the boat and get on these rickety old coaches that sort of rushed us up to Cairo, sort of non-stop, with one armoured car behind us and another armoured car in front of us at one point. So that just, shows you the amount of security involved now in Egypt. I mean, it's almost just a show of strength, really, just to build an air of confidence for tourist trade. But, I mean, it is a very real threat, as was shown, as I said, by the 9 German tourists killed the week before we went out there. Now, the more we came closer to Giza Plateau, the more, sort of Cairo, the more I realised that things had to be done. I had to switch a few switches on the inner plane. And this was important not only for the writings I'm doing, but also for the opening of this Hall of Records. Now, I don't call it Hall of Records, really, I don't like that term. We've always called it the Crystal Chambers, and I'll show you why shortly. But the correct terms that are used for it in the text called the Amduat books is the underworld of the soul. And what else? Basically, the chambers of creation, really, or the chambers of first creation. Because what they represent is an embodiment of the first act of creation. And from that point onwards, the passage of time. And it's something which I've been working on with Bernard, he's the psychic associated with the Black Alchemist Seven Sword affair, since 1985. About, interesting enough, the same time the whole Black Alchemist affair began, he also started picking up a series, having a series of dreams about the Sphinx. Not the Sphinx itself, but chambers beneath the Sphinx. Now, at first, we thought that this was unique, and particularly as he said that he felt that they weren't constructed by the Pharaonic Egyptians, but were much older, a race that had been around about at the end of the last Ice Age. And we then obviously found out that this other psychic, this guy, Edward Casey, had predicted that similar chambers exist beneath the Giza Plateau and referred to them as the Hall of Records. Another psychic called H.C. Randall Stevens, also in the 1930s, came up with similar ideas. And as it turns out, historians and travellers going all the way back to Roman times have spoken about these subterranean passageways containing the sciences and ancient wisdom of an antediluvian race that existed in Egypt, thousands and thousands of years before the rise of civilization. So this is not a new idea at all. And what's more, as I say, the books of the Duat, and also some important building texts at a place called Edford, which I didn't get to visit myself, record the existence of this underground underworld complex. It exists, it's there somewhere. So, but I see it on a much more inner plane level, certainly, as far as questioning is concerned. And even before we visited this church at Old Cairo, I felt I needed to get onto the Giza Plateau. So the first night we were turned away at the entrance. And the second day we went to the pyramids at Saqqara and Dashur, which is a good experience, but I really wanted to get to Giza Plateau. I thought that night, bugger it, I'm going to dress up all completely in black and just try and get on there and just see what happens. So, I managed to get in, and then the police called me, and they cut me out, obviously. And I just sort of acted like a dumb English tourist. And as soon as I got into the shadows, I nipped back and sort of crawled along the ground. Got actually, so the pyramids were in front of me. And this was well commando type stuff, I tell you. And I mean, at one point, some of these guards walked 40 feet away from me, and I was shitting it, I tell you. I thought, this is it, I'm going to get out. But anyway, no, I sort of kept it calm, and I thought, right, I've got to do an important meditation here. So I did this whole complete sketch based on entering beneath the Sphinx into the chambers, through a long corridor, and I'll show you something that's in here. What comes up next? I'll talk about the Holy Temple. And entering into these chambers, which we believe right at the centre is a huge, great stone, almost a phallic stone, like a lingam of Indian Hindu tradition. Possibly, it's almost certainly a crystal, and this represents the crystallisation, the point of first creation. It is the Benben stone. Interesting enough, the text actually refer to it as the Bennett, or a word meaning embryo or seed, which is almost like a female form of the Benben stone, the male phallic Benben stone, which was considered to be, the original symbol of creation in Egyptian myth. So I think that that's what's down there. And the purpose of these chambers is not simply as a library, as Edgar Casey and his latter-day followers believe. To me, it is a place that they perpetuated creation in the outside world. And this is something that's very difficult for us to grasp in our world, I believe. But I think it's similar to what has been done since 1987 in the so-called harmonic convergence idea of preparing the way for the coming millennium, changes in paradigm shifts in human consciousness, all the rest of it. People doing certain meditations and rituals of sacred sites all over the world that somehow this will have effect on the collective unconscious and will change evolution. Now, whether this is correct or not, whether this is actually going to occur, whether the people doing that is irrelevant. The fact they believe they can do it is what I believe these elder gods, these elders of 10,000 BC were doing. That's what they were trying to achieve inside these chambers. They affected the outside world, they affected the evolution of the outside world. And somehow we can still continue that. What we've been doing with Seven Swords over the last 6 years, I believe, is connected with this. It's like the matter of Britain, so to speak, whereas Egypt's a matter of Egypt, obviously, but Egypt's the heart of it all, which is why everybody has got to be at the Great Pyramid for New Year's Eve 1999, basically. Because I think this is a major, crucial point of consciousness change, and the pyramids, the Sphinx, these chambers are calling out. And that's why this will become the unofficial focus of the millennium, I believe, by that time. But more about that next year. This is the Valley Temple. Again, very, very weird place. The core blocks, core stones, again, anything up to 200 tonnes a piece. The posts and lintels made of granite, possibly of a slightly later date, possibly related to the Pyramid Age. But inside this, there is no feel of ancient Egypt. You feel like, I've never been there, you feel like you're in a sort of, in Peru, in a Peruvian temple. And there are so many links between South America and the Pyramid Age, particularly the Giza Plateau, that I think this is a very, very important area of study. Particularly as they found evidence of cocaine within the mummies, shows that there's this relationship between Egypt and South America, certainly in later dynastic times. You can see this is the core blocks. As I say, some of these possibly up to 200 tonnes. I think the estimate of that is possibly a bit high, but certainly up to 100 tonnes, and most of them are between 50 and 70 tonnes apiece. Right, this is the Stele of Revealing. Some of you may recognise this, and my colleague Paul Weston will be talking all about this. This is in the Cairo Museum, and I won't go any more other than the fact that this was very important to Aleister Crowley in the year 1904. But I'll say no more because the same picture will be in Paul Weston's lecture this afternoon. But I was able to see that, obviously. Now, I'll skip that as well, to be honest. That will be Paul's lecture. Now, having done my commando-style meditation on the Giza Plateau, the next day we visited the Cairo Museum, and myself and 3 others shot across to Old Cairo, went into Abu Sergius, St. Sergius' church, this tiny little old church in Old Cairo. And it's supposedly the site where the Virgin Mary went with the young Christ during the flight through Egypt, you know, when they was escaping Herod's persecution. And obviously there's traditions that, you know, Jesus himself was actually brought up in Egypt. I think that's a very strong possibility. But apparently they visited this church and went down in the crypt, you know, did something. Now bearing in mind that we're talking about before Christianity came along, so it shows that this place must have been important even before the time of Christianity, if this story is to be believed. And the place of their focus is this crypt here. Now, the Egyptologist Abdul Aziz Salah, a very respected Egyptian Egyptologist, says that the entrance to this underworld of cathars was the crypt of this church. I mean, that's in an academic work. And yet David Benson picked up all this psychically in 1994 before we had any way of accessing any of this material. So I knew this place was obviously very pokey, very important. And we did the meditation. We visualised ourselves going down into the crypt. Of course, we couldn't do it in the crypt ourselves. We did it in the main, you know, seats, pews within the church. And entering, using the imagery of the Duat underworld, passing through all the different divisions and hours of that until we reached the island. Now, if I can show you this, I'll just sort of chuck this in. I fulfilled one of my ambitions, lying in the sarcophagus of the King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid, even though it was for only about 30 seconds, and managed to record it down. Now, if you can focus that one up, please. Yeah. This was done by Bernard in 1985. This is how the Giza Plateau looked in 9,000 BC, if Bernard is correct. And the strange thing about it is that the Egyptian texts suggest just this, that if you'd have gone to Giza in the past, not only would you have this plush green climate, but that there was an island which represented the Mount of Creation, Hill of Creation, this island, so an island of the egg, or the island of trampling, in the middle of a lake. This lake was known as the Nun, the primeval waters. And on the edge of it was the first temple constructed in Egypt. And on the middle of it was another structure. And this structure led down to something called the underworld of the soul. And this is one of the halls inside it, according to Bernard's things. He drew quite an evocative image. And the next slide. This, if you can possibly put it a bit more to the left as well, as focusing up. Cheers. This is the first of 12 chambers in a circle. 13th one in the middle contains this huge crystal, the representation of the Ben stone. And these all have important acoustic qualities to them, each of them resonating in a different frequency. And this seems to be, you know, what the focus is on the Giza Plateau. This is what everybody's after. And so we did a meditation where we arrived at the Giza Plateau in front of the Sphinx, and we would continue it on when we got to the plateau itself, which was next. And also, to show this is Bernard's drawing of what one of these elders or elder gods look like. But I won't go too much into that. Now, we got to Giza Plateau. I think I've got a picture of that, showed you one earlier on. And we did a meditation going through the corridors to the Chamber of Creation. And that was basically that. The next day we came home. And obviously, I didn't know what the sequence of events was going to be when I was out there, because I arrived 3 or 4 days later than everybody else, and I missed bits and pieces. Nobody out here really knew where I was going. And this is what started to occur. Firstly, my friend and colleague David Southwell I asked him, so, any weird ones, to do with Egypt whilst I was out there? Yeah, one really weird dream I had. And he sort of went to his notes. He said something called merit cigar. Go to the next slide, right? And I said, yeah. He said, right. He said, I was in like this underground tomb, and there was this goddess in the form of a half vulture, half serpent with vulture's wings, and really fierce, aspected woman. And I had to go before it, like some kind of initiation. And when I sort of passed some sort of test, I found myself sort of slipping into another realm. And I was on a boat with her, and the prow of this boat was a serpent. And it was in the Nile, but it wasn't like, it was like the celestial Nile. And we turned up at another site, another temple, something called Dendara. And he said, I found myself going down this long corridor. I said, can you describe it? Yeah, like just a long corridor, like a slope. Oh my God, I was in there, I know all about this. This is the most haunted spot, the whole of Dendara temple. So what happened then? He said, I found myself going underground, some crypts there. And he said, I met another form of this merit cigar down there. And it was like a serpent. I thought, oh my God, that's a serpent that these women go to, when they sort of do the business to try and get fertile. And so he said she then transformed herself into this Coptic-like saint. And I feel that, she continued to be venerated at Dendara as like a Coptic saint. I thought, well, that's weird, because I also found out by sort of Dendara that Dendara Temple became a Coptic centre. So I thought, this is all good stuff. The other thing that we found is that the name Merit Cigar means the boat of the duat, basically. Not as a literal translation, but that's basically what it means. And that the solar boat that passes through the underworld has at the front of its prow, so David Roll was telling me, a Eurate serpent which lights the way, and that's indeed exactly what David said. And I thought, this is good stuff. He had no knowledge at all of where we were going, what direction we'd be going. The fact that we go from Valley of the Kings to Dendara, and I like that. That's nice. I've never heard of Merit Cigar, and now suddenly she's cropping up in people's dreams. And indeed, my other colleague, Richard Ward, also had a dream about Merit Cigar just this week. Obviously in response to all this, but that's really interesting as well. I'll go into that in a moment. And so I spoke to Storm Constantine, and I said, I've got a statue for you. I said, I think it may even be genuine. And she's really happy. And I said, I did a meditation, this commando-style meditation, on the Giza Plateau on Wednesday night. And when I sort of allowed my mind to wander, I said, you cropped up. I see you doing this sketch with Vast. And, darkened room, like darkened statue, blah, blah, I'm going to detail. And, I feel you've got to do it with this statue. I said, I still think it's really important you do it. She said, hold on. I said, when did this occur? I said, Wednesday night. I said, what time? I said, between about 10:30 and 11:30. So she calculated the time. Now, I already knew, she didn't just say this, I already knew that she had a weird one that week related to Bast, so I was anxious to talk to her about this. And she said, my God, said, that same hour, I was in my workroom, I couldn't work, I had the new Verve album on, so I felt a bit sort of, low. I said, well, you would do, listen to the Verve album. Sorry. It really doesn't know, don't worry about it. So she said she was just there, and suddenly she became aware of this presence in the room, a full physical manifestation, or certainly that's the way it appeared, of the goddess Bast. And it just came towards her, and she just embraced it, and just felt all this sort of warmth, love, or whatever it is, going through her. And then just the whole thing just stopped. So I said, you're telling me this happened? And we worked out that it must have been within the half-hour period that I had this weird one with Bast. Sorry, I've seen this this imagery in meditation. I said, this is important, you've got to do the sketch then. And so when she's coming down tomorrow, she'll be with us at Kensal Green Cemetery, and she's coming back to mine afterwards and pick up the statue. But anyway, so I thought, well, that's bloody good, that's really weird. I mean, obviously it shows that I'm on form, and she, you know, she's having these weird experiences, and it's David installed. So I thought, I'll speak to the old mate Bernard. Right, now he's been really inactive for a long time. He's not had anything really. I mean, once in a while, I say, the last thing I think he had was this Egyptian dream several months ago. So I ring him up and say, you know, so anything at all over the past week or so, any weird ones? And he said, oh, just one. So what's that then? He said, something like a cemetery. He said, bones, white bones strewn all over the place, like human bones, as if they're like sort of mummies strewn all over the place. And dogs, black dogs, like roving around, and like he said, not vultures, he specified eagles, flying about overhead, but not touching the bones, almost as if they were like protecting them. It's interesting. I said, any idea whereabouts this is? And he said, you know, I've already mentioned where Valley of the Kings, I've not said hardly anything else. And he said, oh, it could have been Valley of the Kings. So it feels something like a royal burial ground. I thought, that's interesting. I said, that's interesting. I'll speak to Judith Page. She told me about a place somewhere in Egypt where local people, particularly the kids, ravage this cemetery at night and get all the bones out and just strew them all over the Western deserts. And, you know, obviously it's a very sad sight. And it sounded, what Bernard said, this sounded exactly what Bernard said. So I said, I can't remember where it is. I said, it might be Thebes, Valley of the Kings, you know, somewhere beyond there in the desert somewhere. I'll find out. So, so you know, so he starts picking up more as we're talking on the phone. And he says, right, I can see a figure now, a figure in black, and he's got like a pointed hat on. I'm not quite sure, this could be on a Pharaonic hat, but he said he's got black hat, he's got something under his arm, some sort of shoes, it's a scroll. And he says he's coming out like a black, dark doorway, you know, like a cave entrance, into sight, and he's walking between these bones. But he's not touching them, he's just walking through them, the dogs and the rest of it, just allowing him to do this. And he says, this figure's connected with you. And the phone's going really bad on the phone. He said, oh, it's this figure, it's obviously in your room. He said, you know, when he said things like that, you know that it means more than what he's saying. I said, what do you mean? He said, I don't know, you know, and he sort of went on and describing this figure for a bit. And he said, sure, there's nothing in your house. He said, he seems to be there, some sort of guardian, you've pulled him back from Egypt. And I said, he said, have you got a cat in the house? And of course I thought, cat? I've got a cat, I can't keep cats. I suddenly realised what he's talking about. He's talking about this bat statue. So at this point I said, yeah, I know what he's talking about, but I didn't say it. But he said, I can see this figure by this cat. And he said he's like protecting the guardian of it. And, you know, that somehow this cat relates to the cemetery. I thought, this is weird. I said, look, I'll speak to Judith Page and I'll talk to you later about this. But I thought, this is incredible, you know. So I rang up to school, told her. And so then I rang Judith and I said, this cemetery, I said, can you tell me whereabouts it was? This one where the bones were strewn across. Abydos. Exactly the place where I got the bat statue. And so I thought, this is all falls into place. This statue, which I think is genuine, whether it is or it isn't, it's acting like it's genuine. It comes from Abydos. If it is genuine, it's almost certainly been illegally taken out of one of the tombs in the cemetery. It's probably Ptolemaic, if anything. In other words, probably about 2,000 years old. And it's pulled something back with it. And Bernard feels strongly, and we've already done this now, that we should, you know, sort of give a go to this guardian figure, who we did last weekend. And of course, what happens is that as we do this penetration, we realise that he's a form of Kintiamenti, that he's like a humanised form of this dog guardian, this black dog guardian. And so somehow we've punched through this doorway, us to Abydos now, and that this figure, this guy, this guardian of this artefact is still around, basically. But that's something that we've done, we've got over, and now whole downloads of information relating to Abydos, the history of it, the origins of it, are all coming out. So that, at the end of the day, is what it's all about. Quest for knowledge, achieved through intuitive means. And at the end of the day, if I can back all this up with proper scholarly research and not mention the fact that it originally came out through psychic means, then as far as I'm concerned, this is a new form of psychic questing. And of course it also shows that the power and the presence of the old ancient gods and goddesses of Egypt is still very much alive today. Thank you very much.
This talk is about reincarnation, the cathars, and how in some way they seem able to reach out across time in a way that I feel is objectively real, in as much as it affected other people as well as me. The cathars were a Gnostic sect who lived in the south of France, and whose spectacular castles can still be seen to this day. They believed in redemption through self-knowledge, in reincarnation, and were massacred for their beliefs by the Crusaders led by Simon de Montfort. Now I should say at the outset, I'm only too aware of the poor image that reincarnation has. People who claim they're Napoleon, Mary Queen of Scots, High Priests of Atlantis. But it's worth remembering it's a widespread belief endorsed throughout the centuries. Goethe wrote, "As long as you are not aware of the continual law of die and be again, you are merely a vague guest on a dark earth." And Houdini wrote, "I firmly believe somehow, somewhere, and sometime, we return in another human form to carry on, as it were, through another lifetime, perhaps through many succeeding lifetimes, until some strange destiny is carried to its ultimate solution." Now, past life experiences seem to come in pairs. In one, you may be a victim, which is easy to relate to. In the other, a perpetrator, responsible for all kinds of horrors. And these past lives are usually relevant to something in this life, because it seems it's the feelings that cross time and strike a chord in your current psyche. I don't believe it's the other way around, and that it's all projection. But I think imagination may come into it and confuse the issue, and lesser past lives, what regressionists call lost souls wandering around, who may be attracted to you, hitchhikers if you like. Until this event, apart from observing some UFOs, which I wrote about in a story called Finn, I haven't had any major psychic experiences. Most of what I write is science fiction comic books, largely from my imagination. All that was to change with a visit to cathar country. This is Montségur, the legendary castle of the Grail, and as I'm sure many of you will know, also in the region of Rennes-le-Barn, Rennes-le-Château, connected with claims that Christ and Mary Magdalene came here and founded a French dynasty, the subject of the bestseller, The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. Now, I visited most of these places, and they've always left me quite unmoved spiritually. I just love the countryside around there. I had friends in Montpellier and in the area, and for a while I was thinking of buying a house nearby. So what occurred really came very much out of the blue, and the quest began in October 1994, 3 years ago really, to this very day. A girl I'd known as an acquaintance for about a year said she'd been having these strange dreams about me and hadn't been able to sleep properly for weeks. Well, it sounded pretty good, but no, she said, they're not very nice dreams. They involve you in ancient castles in Canada, and they're really disturbing. And castles in Canada, it sounds pretty unlikely. And she looked at me in this very odd kind of way. And she went on to say that they involved in particular one very special castle, and all these scrolls and documents buried underneath it. I looked at my diary at the time, and I saw it written down, "There's something else you're not telling me," you know. Anyway, despite these dreams, we started seeing each other, and her reasoning was very relevant to what followed. She said, "Some things are just meant to be. This is meant to happen." And then the following month, November 1994, I was booked to go to the south of France on holiday and to look at more houses for sale. And so I invited her to come along. I can remember thinking, France is a good long way from Canada, so you know, these dreams shouldn't get in the way of romance. So we had a good time in Montpellier, which is to the east of Cathar country. Neither of us were at all interested in the local history, castles, anything like that. Got drunk on the new Beaujolais, hung out with friends, and then we looked at a beautiful village I was interested in moving to. Drove along the beach road. Bit of the beach there. And then we went up towards the medieval city of Cathars, the incredible castle city that has been used in a number of films like Robin Hood of Thieves. And then on towards Limoux, where we were going to stay. And then the manner changed. We had one of those inexplicable quarrels about absolutely nothing. I can remember sitting in the car thinking, what the hell is going on? As I stared down at the map. I think this is where I'm going to have to switch to the mobile light to figure this out. Let's see. Okay, and so I was staring at the map, and let's see, I'm trying to find the song here. A little bit, just a bit more maybe, a bit more still. Yeah, brilliant. And so there I was, staring at the map, and it was just about as hard to find. And there, looking back at me, was a town, Montreal, just south of Reincarnation. And we both looked at each other and thought, Canada, you know, let's go for it. So, just to set the scene here as to what's what, Montpellier is somewhere over here. There we are. And then you've got the beach road here, and Cathars, which I finally found over there, Montreal, and somewhere down here is Limoux. And also further down here is Rennes-le-Barn, Rennes-le-Château, and up a bit is Albi, which is relevant because, of course, that's the other name for Cathars. They call themselves Albigensians from that town. And Toulouse, I think, is some that away. And then right at the very top, which comes into things later, is a place called Narjac. As you can see, it's a relatively obscure place. And that's right on the sort of northern edge of the Cathar territory. So that, if you like, sets the scene for what was to follow. So, as we drove towards Montreal, the countryside suddenly became very familiar to her. This was the area that the castles she'd seen in her dreams, only that they were at different angles, looking down on the scene rather than from the road. and we reached Montreal, and there's me standing outside Le Quebec restaurant, and you can see the mist starting to rise. And this was not a particularly pleasant experience. Montreal was a major centre of Catharism. It was a scene of a major theological debate between Catholics led by St. Dominic, who I think we have next. This is the Reverend gentleman there, indulging a bit of book burning with the cathars. His order, he founded the Dominicans, who were the main inquisitors. So Montreal was a very important place. And we drove on from there in the general direction of Limoux, and by now the mist was completely enveloping us. And that, I think, gives you some idea of what it was like up there. And bear in mind, I had no idea what was going to happen next. I was seriously spooked. But of course, in the way that these things are, they come out when they're ready, not when you're ready. They've got their own pacing. We saw several ancient castles in the area, but we couldn't find the most important castle. The one in her dreams, the one with the scrolls. We stayed at a gîte in Limoux, and I talked it over with the English owner. And I'll never forget his words. Oh, he said, that's pretty normal around here. People get drawn here. They don't want to come, but they have no choice. They have really weird experiences. Some beating out imaginary flames on their bodies, others crying out for forgiveness. I thought, great. So I asked him, who are these cathars anyway? And how do I find out about them? I really didn't know anything about them. And he recommended Arthur Gurdon, who, of course, is quite well known for writing books about them and reincarnation. And after we left the gîte, I thought to myself, well, maybe we could find this mysterious castle and everything will be okay again, rather naively. So I bought a photo book of Cathar castles. We flipped through it, page after page, and then almost at the very end, my friend said, that's the one. And it was a photo of Narjac, this relatively obscure place I pointed out on the map earlier. And according to the book, it was another Cathar stronghold, razed to the ground by Simon de Montfort and its inhabitants butchered. And we checked on the map and it was just too far to visit. My friend was now looking at me in a very odd way indeed. And she said to me in a very accusatory manner, what are you feeling? Nothing. And she said, look at it. I said, I'm really not feeling anything. And she said, look closer. So I did. And I was suddenly overwhelmed by this feeling of what I can only describe as beast-like exhilaration. I was roaring like an animal. I could feel someone, I don't accept it as me, who was hacking to bits what I assume were cathars, and enjoying it with utter relish. In fact, his only regret seemed to be that he didn't kill more of them. Well, she asked. I remember thinking, damn, why couldn't I have a, forgive the phrase, cathartic experience where I break down in tears and beg her for forgiveness? That probably would be more useful. But instead I gave her a fairly censored version of what I'd seen, ending with, but I know, if this is a past life, I didn't harm you. Yes, she said coldly, but you've hurt a lot of people, and right now I hate you. And that was that, end of romance. She didn't want to talk about it anymore. It really frightened her too much. She gave me odd hints about burnings, and as she gave me a lighter as a present, I was feeling a little nervous myself. Anyway, back in Britain in December, I recall looking into a fire, wondering what this is all about, and hearing this voice inside me, very powerful, saying, they burnt so many of us. And it was a taste of what was to come. Naturally, I had to find out about the cathars, but I just couldn't get interested in them. And as for Najak, I thought, this is miles from anywhere. I'm just not going to visit some obscure place, unless someone pays my expenses. And I had this chilling feeling all the time, which I suspect is true for a lot of psychic quests, that you're not actually searching for it is searching for you. And it won't give up. So I saw one of these past life regressionists, which I don't recommend, by the way, unless you're being seriously haunted, to try and get in touch with the experience, to try and get in touch with a warrior. Now, if you're not familiar with this, there are relaxation techniques. You count down a stairway into the subconscious. You say, what are you seeing? Go to the most important day of your life. Those are the usual techniques. And it's a way, if you like, of breaking through into the subconscious, which is usually blocked by whatever you're doing, smoking, drinking, chilling out, and living this life. And I sometimes wonder whether the technique I've described is actually that good, and how deep it gets you in. Because I didn't need any of that. This guy was raring to go. I wasn't in the slightest bit relaxed. I just lay there, and this guy just went for it. I mean, it was like he'd been waiting for years to tell his story. And as I got in touch with him, and I think he might just, this is very much the kind of guy he is. Obviously, this is a story that came up later. I got this tremendous sense of exhilaration as he hacked his way through a castle. I say he because I see all of us as having personalities that are multiple and past lives as separate personas within us. I don't think you can take the credit or the blame for what they do. And I wrote about him later in a graphic novel I'm doing for France with Debbie Gallagher, entitled Savage Rose, and I think this image by artist Will Simpson does him justice. He absolutely adored violence. On another level, I think he was that part of our psyche that people call the beast. I saw him thrown into a burial pit, still alive. He was impaled with a spear, and he tried to climb up it and kill his enemies. This guy was a serious psychopath. Then there was a female image, and I thought, oh no, what's he going to do now? But instead, the scene changed into a much more powerful scene. The burning of a 16-year-old witch at the stake. It was horrifically powerful and had details that were totally outside my experience and became the basis of 3 stories I wrote, including Slain, which I wrote really to try and get it out of my head. This one is the closest and the most powerful. It's from Char, a graphic novel I've written for France, painted by artist Olivier Ledoir, who actually lives in Montpellier. And I think you can see at the top there, the eyes of her other lives staring out as she faces execution. She was walking along a flat stretch of river to the place of execution. People were muttering in Latin and wearing 16th century black puritanical clothes. And up above, elementals were shooting through the night sky like rocket flares. And the emotion I felt, she felt, was one of so much anger. She was calling to them, "You're my friends, why aren't you helping me?" But they couldn't. They'd come to usher her into the spirit world. So this wasn't some poor kid falsely accused of being a witch. They'd got the real thing. Now this next bit's a little embarrassing because I found myself forming a crucifix with my arms and spitting on it and screaming, "I'm going to come back and effing crucify you all." Because that's the last thing she would have seen, was a crucifix shoved right in her face and some holy chap telling her to repent. And that was the end of the session. I walked out in absolute tears. Which is why I say a word of warning about regressions or any psychic experience. go to someone who really takes it seriously. You have to close the door on it afterwards. The regressionist I saw treated it all as straightforward imaginary archetypes from the subconscious, but not for long. When I went back to see him later and talked about the things that happened, I swear to you, he suddenly went, damn, she's in my head now as well. He'd probably dismiss it, of course, as projection or auto-suggestion. But if you don't close the door on these things, you're going to walk around with them, which I did for days, and I believe I was meant to. You might say it's a form of possession, but I don't see it like that, because I always felt in control, and I saw her as separate, and yet connected. I mean, I know we live in the wrong century to talk about multiple personalities and listening to voices, unless you've got an excuse for it like me, like being a writer. Anyway, that night I lit a candle for her, and I remember saying that I wanted her to be at peace, that I had to get on with my life now, that there was nothing I could do for her except tell her story. And all I got was this inner voice repeating, mummy, daddy, baby, mummy, daddy, baby, on and off for 2 days, until I realised, of course, when they caught a witch, that they got the whole family, they burnt them all. So I lit 3 more candles, and the voice stopped. So we then got to February 1995, and I got in touch with some pagan friends of mine in northern France, and we had a wake for her, a party to honour her and say goodbye. We had all these old cheeses and wines that she might recognise, and she insisted on veal pie. It was odd, weird details like that, which made her seem very real to my friends as well as to me. Everything had to be precise. She had that sort of teenage impatience, an inability to discuss things, just insist on them. She relived her death trauma, and it was exceedingly powerful and moving. And all manner of details have convinced me that this is something much more than a dark alter ego, although I'm sure it's that perhaps too. And by now, more details were coming up as fragments. At the end of her life, they gagged her with a metal cage or band around her throat, so she couldn't curse them when she burnt. Her name was Claretta DeVoe, Lara for short. DeVoe means veal. I think it meant she was the daughter of the cow goddess, and she seemed to have another name as well, Devoir, the voice. I assume the first name was a secret name because of persecution. Bear in mind, I barely speak French. I mean, all my things are translated into French. So when these names were coming at me, I had no idea what they meant. And it's a hard thing to describe, really. I definitely saw her as a separate person, because, I mean, she was, if you like, talking, she's saying, I'm not a writer, I'm a poisoner. And at first I thought, what, she's talking about natural herbs, but frankly, I think I was kidding myself. It was only later my friends pointed out that the old biblical name for a witch, of course, is poisoner. She lived in South France, 1574 to 1589, at the height of the burning times. And from everything I've read, that region, at that time, underwent a greater persecution than anywhere else in Europe. I mean, to quote, for example, from a book by the French public prosecutor at the time, Jean Baudin, in 1580, it's like a manual for witch finders. He says, in witch trials, children should be forced to testify against their parents. In fact, I recommend torturing children and invalids. And to put the fear of God into them, I advocate cautery and hot irons, so that the putrefied flesh will have to be cut out. As for witches, whatever punishment one can order against them by roasting and cooking them over a slow fire is not really very much, and not as bad as the torment which Satan has made for them in this world, to say nothing of the eternal agonies which are prepared for them in hell. Estimates of those murdered during the burning times vary, but 250,000 women, men and children throughout Europe is regarded as a minimum figure. She thought our notion of time was ludicrous and told us how ridiculous we were to wear watches. To her, there was no past or present. You lived just one life in different bodies. She was malevolent, venomous even towards anything Christian, especially what she described as angels, which she hated with such a passion. And she seemed to see the burning times in a different way to how history records them as the end of the old religion or a genocidal attack on women. To her, it was a very straightforward battle for souls, and you had to be very clear which side you were on. She despised our era, where it isn't clear. She despised my liberal views on this, and indeed anything that involved compromise. Which is possibly why she would only give odd hints about revenge and how much pleasure she was getting from it, which was quite heavy and, I'm afraid, quite unrepeatable. It's very much like having a kind of one-sided relationship with someone. She knew everything about me, but I only knew what she cared to show me about her. There were other odd bits which, again, I haven't really been able to make sense of. As she was dying, it was like she seemed to refer to things like a circle of power, sending around the circle of time, talking about poison not diluting what she was about. For her also, it was vitally important to identify the enemy, whom she saw ultimately as angels, and people possessed or influenced by angels. She found their purity, their otherworldliness, utterly offensive. She was fanatically suspicious and fearful of any images or people that showed angels in a noble light. I was in this room with this guy who had some angel images, and it was like electricity, you know. She just couldn't bear to be in the room. It was like making her ill. I think the artist has really captured the feeling of a classic angelic enemy in a fictional character from Shah. Now, this guy, to me, is very frightening. And if you've seen any pictures of inquisitors responsible for mass murder, like Torquemada or St. Dominic we saw earlier, you'll know that they are extremely angelic and pure-looking. I think it's a misnomer to think that evil people are necessarily evil-looking. I tried to see if there was a connection with the cathars, which means the pure ones, but she didn't seem to have a view on them. Clearly, she wasn't a cathar. So I just happened to forget about them. But then, still in February, I got a surprise invitation to visit Angoulême Comic Convention in March, all expenses paid, which is very unusual for the French. Let's see. So, yeah. Just show you where, we've got Narjac down there, and then just at the top there, just in the top left-hand corner, just up a bit, you can see Angoulême. So as you can see, what I've been saying earlier about, well, I'm not going there unless the universe pays my fare, it actually come to happen, because as you can see, it's half a day's drive, something like that, to Narjac. So I thought I had to go. You know, this had to happen. And I think next we've got that's another photo of Narjac. And in a very matter-of-fact way, Lara said Narjac was at home. And I made the mistake of questioning this. I just didn't want to get carried away on some indulgent psychic trip, because I thought, well, Narjac's connected with the cathars, not her. And anyway, the place where she burned was flat, and Narjac was up in the mountains. And I felt this psychic scream. It was like, how dare you challenge me? It's where I burnt. And if you've ever argued with a 16-year-old girl in life, you'll know what a mistake it is to argue with a 16-year-old who's died. So I'm all set for Angoulême, and the next thing, I find myself humming and singing 3 coins in a fountain to myself for 2 or 3 days, a song I personally despise and never recall singing before, until I realised that I was meant to put 3 coins in the fountain at Narjac, 1 for each per family. So then we reached March 1995, and I drove to Narjac, which thoroughly spooked me. But now I guess I was expecting it to. So I kind of discount that. I'm trying very hard to discount any kind of auto-suggestion, etc., etc. I found the river, which runs below the town, and thus is flat land, roughly as I visualised it. So she was right there. And I dropped some flowers in it and let the current take them away. But what was intensely moving and powerful was the medieval fountain I found in the town centre. I put the coins in, and she wouldn't let me go until I put a 4th coin in for her. Her love, her devotion to her family was like nothing I've ever experienced or observed before, and was so touching. I think a witch family in those times was very different, not just to our modern families, but to the families around them. They were like hunted animals clinging together for comfort. It's like they weren't individuals, they were her, she was them, and she just wanted to be with them. She didn't want to come back, she didn't want to be in this life. And gradually over the months that followed, she started to fade away. And when she left, I felt quite empty and missed her greatly. And the book Shah is really her story. And I began it with a poem by Ovid about reincarnation, which I guess is my tribute to her. Death has no power the immortal soul to slay, that when its present body turns to clay, seeks a fresh home, and with unlessened might, inspires another frame with life and light. And as she faded away, the crusader grew stronger. Curiously, he was never as real. There was no name, no details about his life, no real character, no moments of humour or softness, just a persistent rage. The crusader kept insisting the cathars were satanic and deserved to die. And some of his fury seemed to have an echo in that other past life. But I had to find out. Now, the usual books on cathars, especially by Arthur Gurdon, tend to paint them as whiter than white, and anything negative is dismissed as crusader propaganda. And I was quite happy to believe this, but I eventually found enough evidence to satisfy me that this is only part of the truth. To understand them, one has to go back, if you like, to the Christian origin of the Gnostics and their Gospels. Their basic belief is that ignorance, not sin, is the basis of suffering. So their search is for gnosis, for self-knowledge. And as one of their Gospels says, if you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. Which all sounds very creditable, and indeed there were many aspects of the early Gnostics that seemed quite admirable. When they met, they all participated by drawing lots. So one would be the bishop one week and a layman the next. An Orthodox priest at the time attacked them, saying they all have access equally. They listen equally, they pray equally, even pagans. They also share the kiss of peace with all who come. All of them are arrogant. All offer you gnosis. Particularly women. These heretical women, how audacious they are. They have no modesty. They are bold enough to teach, to engage in argument, to enact exorcisms, to undertake cures, and even to baptize. All this was very early on, somewhere before 200 AD. But in the centuries that followed, Gnosticism seems to have developed a number of characteristics that are less than admirable. It became elitist. It was very secretive, obviously to avoid persecution. It constantly diversified into many forms, and some of them seemed extremely unattractive. It became very dualistic, to the point of either being sex-mad or totally puritanical, and also very rigid. And there were all manner of bizarre sects, of which some of the freakiest were the Stylites, who sought gnosis on the tops of pillars, the cathars, who loaded themselves down with chains so they could crawl around on all fours, the castrants, who castrated themselves, the Fabianites, who seemed to have practiced some kind of tantric sex magic. They claimed 365 archons, or demons, guarded enlightenment, so they had to have sex at least 365 times, preferably with 365 different partners, on the path up to enlightenment, offering themselves to the demons at the point of orgasm, and then 365 times on the way back. Afterwards, they became known as the lazy ones. The bishop of the time describes them, they lie down to sleep in the open air, men and women together in total promiscuity. They eat of the best without ever having to work for it. They spend their time doing nothing and sleeping. They lead the most debauched lives, for according to them, none of this matters in the slightest. But the cathars really can't be seen as separate to this. There was a group calling themselves the cathars around 300 AD, who went into some very unpleasant sex rituals. There are at least 30 different cathar sects listed in historical writings. One really can't see them as one entity. They're a diverse group, such as the Begards, a cathar sect of France, Holland and Germany, who practice nudity, coitus interruptus. You have the Bogomils, from which allegedly the word buggery is meant to have originated. They swung from being strictly puritanical to a belief system where, after a period of purification, self-denial was no longer necessary. And Emma Jung, in the Grail legend, quotes that Gnostic traditions survived into the early Middle Ages is proved by the boxers found in Provence, on which are portrayed naked initiates. So, as these new images of cathars came up, I began to see there's something in what this crusader was saying. I have to say, I personally didn't care, and I still don't actually give a damn. I suppose in saying this, it is really this angry warrior, this crusader talking, it certainly isn't me. But I felt that if I wrote a story about all this, that really could get out of my head. So the result was Slaying the Grail War, and a forthcoming story, Secret of the Grail, about the siege of Montsegur, the Cathars' last stand. And you can see at the top the phoenix rising from the flames, a potent symbol of reincarnation, and the Grail stone, both of which come from Parzival, which features the Castle of the Grail. And the story focuses on this marvellous Cathar heroine, the priestess Esclamante de Foix, guardian of the Grail stone, and also the murderous Simon de Montfort. And all the time, I could still feel myself driven by this crusader's hatred. And it was so obscure. It's a bit like graffiti I once saw on a little wall which said, "Piss off all Bolivians." I mean, why Bolivians? Why not Uruguayans or Paraguayans? I just didn't care. But all kinds of odd coincidences were happening, designed, I believe, to make me care. One evening I was sitting in my lounge with a psychic friend who told me he could see some angry medieval peasants in the room behind us staring at me, and that they were being kept at bay by this huge, arrogant brute of a man covered in dust. Okay, I think, he's psychic, maybe this is all projection, I need some proof, some reason for taking this seriously. What do they want, I asked him. They want to harm you, he replied. And at that precise moment, someone outside my house started banging his fists on my windows, and there's a guy there I've never seen before in my life, his face pressed up against the glass, yelling and cursing, shaking his fist at me. absolutely demented with rage. Then he headed off into the night. I went to the south of France on business, met an English music producer living near Toulouse who just happened to own the film rights to a novel about the cathars called Circle of Stars. And I said, well, what's it about? And he said, it's the story of how the evil Simon de Montfort is reincarnated in the 20th century, bent on stealing the Grail and killing people who were cathars in a past life. And he said, you know, he was after a screenplay for it. And I went home and I read the book, which was one of those tedious airport novels, and just forgot about it. I just don't want to know. And then back in Britain, a film producer I knew said, she'd been planning a film about the cathars and the Grail. Would I be interested in revising this pretty rough screenplay? I looked at it, I thought, no. Once again, I just don't want to get into it. I never read novels usually, because I don't want to be too influenced by other people's fictional ideas, but for some odd reason, I picked up science fiction writers Thomas N. Ditcher's The Priest, and to my surprise, it featured crusaders crossing time into the 20th century, exterminating cathars, drawing a priest into a medieval hell, and the most scary and perverted past life experiences and tortures. And Ditcher's conclusion in the novel is that all past lives are simply disembodied fragments of our personas and are entirely subjective. I don't believe this myself, and I'm actually not convinced he does. I read this next piece out to some friends, and it goes like this. I'm not an effing heretic. I don't know anything about the goddamn cathars. As far as I'm concerned, they're ancient history. All I am is an effing science fiction writer who wrote a book about effing UFOs. It's all bullshit. I have a good imagination. That was the story of my life, till now. Till I went to Montpellier and got zapped into this nightmare. Who's that? I asked my friends. Sounds like you, they said. No, I replied, it's one of the main characters in Ditcher's novel, The Priest. It pretty well echoes my own feelings. So, one story really didn't seem to do justice to these complex issues and people. It seemed important to do another, which once again explored both sides of catharism. And this is Savage Rose, painted by Will Simpson. It features a cathar heroine who escapes the dark rituals of her sect and also the cries of the Inquisition. Now, I covered some of these themes last year at the Psychic Question Conference, and by then I'd reached a possible conclusion. That the phenomena was about a balance between two past lives, perpetrator and victim. That the Crusader desperately needed to tell his story, and maybe realised by killing cathars he'd actually given them what they wanted, escape from an earth they despised. And the victim, Lara, who was maybe paying the price for his atrocities, and perhaps needed to let go of her rage against the cross. I say maybe and perhaps because I think it's patronising for me to make a judgment on somebody else's pain. But all these stories were an acknowledgement of those killed in the burning times, witch and Christian. And I really hoped that this would be an end to the quest. I wanted to get back to writing effing science fiction that would be all bullshit. Instead, a new phase began, which certainly included some psychic bullshit. First, other past lives came up. Like a powerful vision of a young Nazi soldier who had a guilty affair with a Jewess, absolutely horrified when they capture her, and turns into a kind of animal on the Russian front. A kind of manifestation of the beast. And this story too was quite powerful, and because it's about World War II, I couldn't really use it as such, so I converted it into this slain story where he turns into an animal, and it was incredibly easy to write, and it just flowed away. There was also a 10th century warrior in the Jewish principality of Gothia, which is the same area of France I've been talking about, around Montpellier. was on horseback hunting down a Gentile in some strange scapegoat ritual. Now, neither of these past lives meant anything to me other than with their concepts of alternating guilt and persecution. They seemed to be variations on the original two lives. Like someone was still trying to tell me something I just couldn't grasp. The weird anger towards cathars continued. And there seemed to be two possible explanations. First, past life karma, spirits of the dead reaching out across time. But I really felt I'd dealt with that. I got the message. Hunter always becomes hunter. Okay, now go away. Well, secondly, perhaps a connection in this life. And that's really where the quest ends in what I hope is its final phase. I think there is always an important link in this life. It might be a traumatic event that resonates with the past, a personality trait in common, family or friends you've met before in another life, or an incident in this life that you've blocked out. But for reasons I don't understand, it may be mixed up with total fantasies. And what I came up with seemed to be half fiction, half fact. So, first the fact part. One day last spring, I suddenly had this overwhelming feeling that the cathars were still around. I remember thinking, that's nonsense, they died out in the 13th century. Anyway, so what? But I got this persistent nagging to investigate, which I've tried ignoring before, and it just continues until I act on it. And in the space of 1 hour, looking up articles on the web and elsewhere, I built up an extraordinary picture of modern-day Catharism. The Gnostic Catholic Church was revived by Jules Douanel and Papus, two leading French occultists at the end of the 19th century. Their ceremonies were specifically Cathar and caused enough alarm for the Vatican to concern itself on the resurgence of Cathar tendencies, and for the Pope to condemn this new manifestation of the ancient Albigensian heresy. And it was closely linked to Aleister Crowley, who devised his Gnostic Mass in 1912, because Crowley subsequently appointed a Dr. Crowe Patriarch of the Gnostic Catholic Church, and there's correspondence on this in the late 1940s. The founder of the OTO, Theodore Roos, claimed to be a primate of the Gnostic Catholic Church. It's really more a case of who these latter-day Cathars weren't involved with. Rosicrucians, French Masonic lodges, Protocols of Zion, you name it. And that was very likely imported to Britain, seems evident from Crowley's involvement. The Gnostic Catholic Church is actually alive and well in the States these days and describes itself as a Thelemic religion. I should add, by the way, that this revival has absolutely nothing to do with an American Cathar church, which dates back to 1789. But certainly this whole Gnostic belief system continues in multiple and indeed opposing forms to the present day. Heaven's Gate, the suicide cult, was essentially Gnostic and is recognized as such. The belief systems are almost identical. The desire to leave Earth behind and ascend to higher realms. And while Heaven's Gate were waiting for space beings, the Cathars had their inhuman deity from beyond, whom they called the alien. Heaven's Gate also had members who castrated themselves. Incidentally, we'd satirised these kind of people some time ago in Finn, where they look up at the sky and at UFOs, and this chap here is saying, "What is it, Mum?" And she's replying, "The answer." And our conclusion and our comment on UFOs, that the UFO lights are a trick, beads to the natives. They play symphonies on our neural networks. And I would guess that what happened to Heaven's Gate and the ascetic forms of Catharism is similar. It's some kind of psychic virus that screws people's minds and gives them the desire to reject their humanity and the earth. Now to the fiction. Catharism, in its darkest form, seemed to me to tie in with a cult I knew vaguely in my youth, and which I had barely any conscious memory of. It's possible they called themselves cathars, pure ones, and it's possible I knew them much better than unconsciously aware of. And this could explain my animosity to them, because I'd run out of every other option. Certainly that's what my subconscious said, and it felt like a damn good explanation. Unfortunately, that's where the bullshit comes in, because I found myself remembering, in quotes, lots of weird stuff, unpleasant left-hand path occultism about this unlikely bunch of latter-day cathars, which I was able to prove in at least 3 areas as total nonsense, and just the odd fact here or there providing circumstantial proof, which just isn't good enough. Because I think if you're going to do a psychic quest, you've got to be brutally honest and objective. So I just knocked that line of inquiry on the head, which was disappointing. But here was a curious thing, that these fantasies and feelings were ferocious, far stronger, and far more disturbing than anything I've talked about so far, including Lara. For about 2 months, I could hardly get any work done. I was just totally caught up in this. Provided me with remarkable stories, entire plots, characters, backgrounds, all thoroughly worked out for me. I just sat back and tuned into them. I've heard of other writers being told entire stories in dreams, but it's never happened to me before. And if it's madness or an overheated imagination, it's very valuable. Because it's fiction, as far as I'm concerned, I'll only refer to it briefly. It involved vendettas across time, an offshoot of catharism that was forged in hate in a concentration camp during the war and turned into a post-war sect, angelic interventions, and a very dark view of the Beat generation in the 1960s in the UK. But when it was all over, and the whole phenomena disappeared, the synchronicity, spooky events, hatred of cathars, just all vanished. It felt brilliant. It was like a final exorcism, a final catharsis. I can't explain it. Maybe the subconscious doesn't have our conscious desire for objective truth and is quite happy to use a modern-day fantasy to rid itself of something from long ago, if that's the only way it can do it. Or maybe there are things out there who just enjoy telling us porkies. But I firmly believe that this last fictional stage, despite being so absurd, was the most important stage of all. I still get the odd bit of synchronicity. To my absolute astonishment, which freaked out my most cynical friend, just 2 months ago, someone I was dating claimed she was a cathar in a past life, and hey, I was triggering these traumatic memories she didn't understand, etc., etc. I remember thinking, why can't she claim she's an Atlantean priestess in Napoleon, or someone interesting? I just decided to ignore it. I feel it's better not to pursue it, just in case it starts pursuing me again. Thanks for listening.